Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to give a quick welcome and then I'm going to turn it over so that we can maximize our time with our presenters. My name is Emmeline Harrigan and I'm the current president of the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association, and we're your host for today's webinar. Just wanted to speak to the topic in terms of, we've had a lot of discussion, I think, as planners about conflict resolution, some of the things that we have to deal with as professionals within our particular arena of the interface between applicants and the public and our commissioners. And I think that this presentation goes a long way in terms of really discussing very specific scenarios and helping us kind of understand, how to move forward when we encounter difficult situations. In looking at some of the scenarios, I myself kind of thought, oh my gosh, I've been through that. And you may feel the same way too, as through the course of the webinar. My hope through all of this is, when you read that newspaper article in your regional area and you hear a story that's similar to something that you just experienced, that you also reach out to your fellow planners. I think my hope through all of this is that we learn to rely on each other as colleagues within this sometimes very challenging profession, and hope to look to each other as resources. So with that said, again, I hope you enjoy this webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to Evan.
Thanks, Emmeline, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Evan Seeman. I'm not a planner, but I'm a land use lawyer at Robinson & Cole, and very excited to be part of this program today. I'm just going to be the moderator. We do have some great panelists that I'll introduce in just a moment. We thought that the timing of this program on conflict resolution was especially appropriate because October is Mental Health Awareness Month. And as many, if not all of you know, as planning professionals, you're always in difficult situations. Decisions that you make are almost always going to make, or very often are going to make one person or party happy and the other have the opposite effect, unhappy. So today's program, as Emmeline mentioned, is focused on conflict resolution. We hope to provide you with some tools that you can take back to your everyday planning professional lives. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. And the first is Bill Logue. Bill is a West Hartford-based independent mediator, facilitator, consensus builder, trainer, and consultant. Bill, thanks for joining us. We also have two municipal planners who I think many of you know. The first is Susmitha Attota, who is the town planner of Stratford. She has more than 20 years of experience in urban planning. And then also Jeremy DeCarli, who is the planning and zoning official for the town of East Hampton. So Jeremy is not only the town planner, but he's also the zoning enforcement officer and wetlands enforcement officer. So just to give a brief overview of the structure of today's program, in about a minute, I'm going to hand it over to Bill to give an overview of what he sees in conflict resolution and some strategies that he utilizes as a consultant. After that, we have developed some scenarios that we're going to go through and hope to generate some discussion. We have about 5 or 6 scenarios. I'm not sure we'll get through all of them today, but some of them will involve dealing with the big picture, getting beyond the usual suspects who attend all of your land use agency meetings, dealing with upset individuals, and how to prioritize certain things with your planning and zoning commission if they may have other areas that they think are more important. So you'll see in the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A feature. You can click that Q&A button and type your question in, and we'll respond either live or we can respond in writing to you. So feel free to let your questions fly. And with that, Bill, please take it away.
Well, thanks, Evan. I appreciate it. I'm trained as a lawyer, but I haven't practiced in decades, so I've gotten outside of your world. My father was an urban planner, so I've been in pieces of everybody else's world, riding around in the back of the car, wondering why we're driving in certain places. And somehow I made my way to conflict resolution. So I'm just going to take a short amount of time to kind of give a high-level overview of collaborative decision-making and Much of what I'm speaking to is for some of the more complex cases, but there are techniques that you can use on the small projects or the personal interactions when folks walk into your office. So on the complex issues, collaboration can really be much more effective in the long run because stakeholders who are part of an informed decision-making process are going to be committed to the implementation or at least raise fewer objections. Consensus building and collaborative processes hopefully will diminish some of the polarization we see out there, the power plays that can have long-term negative impacts and consequences for a community. When you think about collaboration, I want you to think about collaboration that you can set up or encourage by boards and commissions and encourage in the private sector before an application comes in. So as a framework for some of the analysis to think about these opportunities, large or small, is as a negotiation. And the panel is going to get into a bunch of ideas and techniques and the scenarios, and we'll get into some of the conflict resolution aspects of that there. In terms of negotiation concepts, traditionally, we tend to think about things as zero sum. A gain for one party is a loss for the other. So for me to do well, you can't do well. So that means there's a winner and a loser. And we all know how much we hate losing. So this kind of oppositional approach tends to polarize things. And a project's proposed, people who are concerned start to raise questions. They express them to others. Sometimes they raise them with you or the board. Sometimes there's a response. Sometimes there's not. That then starts to get others involved, and communication tends to diminish. Some of the demands are put out there, the press releases, the websites, the social media ensue. And people start to really demonize each other, and the listening stops. So we're going to think about what are ways that we can change that to get people to listen to each other. So if we stop thinking about it as demands, but what are the underlying interests, the needs and the desires of the parties, the why somebody is saying something, and this can change the lens that we're viewing things. Not, I don't want this project to happen, to, are there concerns about the traffic? Is it about preserving community scale and what's visible from their home or the streetscape? So that gets to the substantive interests of what happens, but also what's really important in collaborative process are two other kinds of interests. The procedural interests. How are meetings scheduled? Where are they scheduled? How are they structured and designed? And the psychological interest, do people feel kind of seen, heard, and respected in the process? So I'm going to go through some of the opportunities for collaboration and land use decision-making. But one of the first things, why would you want to do it? Well, in many instances, it can save time and money in the long run because decisions are less likely to be challenged or will be easier to uphold. It focuses folks on the relevant issues and promotes joint problem solving and educates stakeholders on the nature of the problem. It allows a variety of interests to be addressed in a more productive way and creates opportunities for joint problem solving. It's kind of, let's be hard on the problem and soft on the people. And it hopefully minimizes some of the political risk by reducing the vulnerabilities of public officials, of charges of kind of acting unilaterally or being out of touch with the public interest. And hopefully that will increase confidence in government, which is under stress right these days, because the community will believe that a situation was handled fairly, and therefore they're more likely to trust future decisions. So, in considering opportunities for a public participation process, we'll think about sponsors and conveners, and you need to be really clear about what kind of process you're doing. In kind of broad terms, those are things like informing, consulting, involving, collaborating, and empowering. That's the way the International Association for Public Participation frames the issues. If you're informing, that's really just kind of telling folks what's going on. And that's not really engaging them in a way they're used to that happening. It's fact sheets and websites and open houses. If you're consulting with the public, it's kind of getting feedback and analysis on what the alternatives are in some of the decisions. And that's kind of a process by which the people who are sponsoring it are saying, we'll keep you informed, we'll listen to what you have to say and acknowledge some of those aspirations, and we'll provide some feedback. And so those are the typical public comment periods, focus groups, surveys, and some of the public meetings. Then the next level up is involvement. And that's really working directly with the public to make sure that the concerns and the aspirations are understood and considered. And not only they're reflected in the alternatives, but their feedbacks on how the input influenced the decision. That's kind of the workshops and maybe deliberative polling. Collaboration is another higher level. And that's really having the public get involved in developing some of the preferred solutions out there, and using those to the maximum extent possible. So that gets into consensus building and advisory committees and other kind of participatory decision making. And the last step is really empowering folks. And that's when you might take something to the ballot box. So those are kind of being very clear at the outset what kind of process you're engaging in becomes important. But first you need to figure out what process is it and is it appropriate? So is it the right time? Is it the right process? Is it the right project? I always think about, can you move upstream? If you're going earlier, it's better to plan and assess. So you kind of want to look for what are some of the characteristics, does the decision-making body have any discretion in its decision? And will that decision have any long-term effects or far-reaching effects? And is a political or a legal challenge likely out of this situation? So if some of those characteristics are present, what criteria might you use to think about, is it appropriate in these situations? So is your decision-making body willing to endorse a collaborative approach? So are the key stakeholders willing to be involved and participate? Are at least some of the issues negotiable here? Do folks feel that they can be resolved in a timely manner and they're compelling enough to be worth their time and attention? And they have some reservations about the alternatives to working collaboratively, and that there are some opportunity for some mutual gains by gathering around the table. And there's some frustration with the status quo. And can the process, the traditional process that's being undertaken, incorporate the product of a collaborative approach? So then you might think about, okay, do we need a convener to bring people together? Do we need somebody who's kind of a process coach to advise people on how to go about? Do you need to go get outside assistance from a planning firm, a facilitator, or a mediator to move forward? But in any approach, you want to make sure that you're being inclusive and transparent and proactive, and that the outcomes, there's going to be some receptivity to it. So there are a number of opportunities that are out there for incorporating the decision-making process where the party's interests can be heard and considered. And there's a good faith attempt to accommodate and to satisfy as many of those interests as possible. So those might be things like pre-application negotiation with the developer, pre-application negotiation and information sessions or other outreach by the developer with community members, neighborhoods, and affected stakeholders. In preparation for the plan of conservation and development, kind of visioning processes, public hearings on the adoption and amendments to the POCD, and things like zoning regs, subdivision approvals, site plan approvals, special permit applications, wetlands permits, pre-application review of variances. And if it's really created issues, you may be involved in the court process, and there are opportunities to step outside of that and think about mediation or other ways of stepping back. So, one of the kind of some of the steps to supplement the traditional decision-making process is, start by identifying who are the relevant stakeholders and what type of process. Is it consultative? Is it collaborative? What's going to work best? Do you need third-party assistance or not? What are the underlying interests? How do they intersect? Which ones are overlapping? Which ones may be mutually exclusive? It's taking a step back and making sure you aren't proposing or debating positions at these early stages, but really encouraging stakeholder participation early in the process and seeking and valuing that input throughout the entire process. And thinking of how do you reach beyond the usual folks out there, and we'll get into that in terms of some of the scenarios that are coming up, and trying to build relationships among the stakeholders and humanizing each other. I always think about kind of breaking bread at meetings. That's a great way of getting people to have some level of connection as they're grabbing a cup of coffee or a beverage or having a snack. Making sure that information is available to all parties, and you're doing, if you have a longer process, that there are ways for people to catch up who may not have been involved early. And also, is there a range of potential solutions out there? As much as I really feel that collaboration is wonderful, it isn't right for every situation. It takes time, it takes effort, it can be expensive. And people can come late into the process and undo progress. It's not always successful. And in these days, we're finding process itself is under attack in many ways. And one of the things that I've seen that is most difficult for any future process, if is a board or a commission lets some public process occur and then totally disregards the outcomes of that process and don't explain how it was considered in the decisions that they're making. That not only has an impact on what just occurred, but it really sets a poor stage for things that might happen in the future. So lastly, is just thinking about, the act of bringing people together. Is there somebody who can be a convener to bring it together? Is it part of your role? Is it something that the board or commission or another elected official might do? Is there a legislator or a citizens organization, a community group, or the developer themselves that might bring people together? And are there the resources and kind of a work plan for going forward? So those are kind of all things, kind of leading by example and setting the tone. And that is done in small ways, from when somebody walks in your office, how they are received, how they're spoken to, how things are explained to them, to doing a large public meeting. In the last few years, I've done work with outside of the specific planning area with a municipality in Massachusetts that was looking at budget overrides. They had plans to do capital improvements for public works, fire and safety, a library, and a school. How did the community want those prioritized? What should be taken up first? I'm working with a school system now in Massachusetts that needs to build 1 or 2 new elementary schools. We're doing listening sessions to get core values, to get people's preferences about some of the things, so that those can go forward with the school committee, or it might be going forward elsewhere with the various boards and commissions about how to incorporate this. I've done visioning processes around extensions of public transit and what that might mean for transit-oriented development. And it's the kinds of charrettes and things that you're terribly familiar with. So that's really kind of very quick and high-level overview of the more complex types of and intentional types of collaborative process. And we can get into the nitty-gritty details and what happens when somebody walks up to the counter or comes into your office, or you're in the meeting that just feels like it's going south. What are some of the techniques that you can use? And we can walk through those in the scenarios.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Bill. That was just an excellent overview to get us going on some of these scenarios that we have. So I'm going to bring those up. I'm going to share my screen, but we also want you all to participate, ask questions, give us ideas, strategies that you might take for these various scenarios. So let's jump into it. Scenario 1. You are tasked with updating the town plan of conservation and development. You know that if you hold public workshops on the plan in the town hall, you'll see the same set of people that attends most every planning and zoning commission meeting who have the same agenda. Also, this group is not diverse enough to represent the demographic makeup of your community. What should you not do to avoid pitfalls in the planning process? Jeremy, Susmitha, one of you want to kick it off?
I'd say kick it to Susmitha first.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there's an echo.
I can jump in a little if you'd like, Evan, while
for it.
Susmitha is connecting. I think, rather than waiting for people to come to you, you need to think about going to them. And that's, it can be reaching out through organizations, the Chamber of Commerce, the sports leagues for kids in town, the religious organizations, but thinking about where you hold different kinds of meetings, going to the senior center, doing them to the library, at the library, in the middle schools or the high schools. They often have good spaces for that, the houses of worship, and going to those meetings to present, not only just to gather information, but forecast what is coming up and the places that can be, the times and places that people can be involved, so that you're getting beyond what are often called the usual suspects. And thinking about, are there neighborhood associations and other groups that can help you spread the word, Facebook groups now that are out there, so that will help get people aware that something is at least happening, so it doesn't come as a surprise later in the process as decisions are being made. And then I often find it's very helpful when an organization or a group is making a decision to forecast some of those, if it's the right kind of setting, so that people can react to almost a draft before it feels final.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I've been facing some challenges with technology today. But yeah, I can give you my insight on this based on my experience. First of all, I would like to state for the record that I'm no expert in conflict resolution. I have 2 children that fight all the time and I can't resolve their conflict. So obviously, I still have a lot to learn. But based on the experience I gained in the planning processes that I've worked on so far, I would say the first no is, or maybe as a planner, we should be very cautious about forming any community advisory committees or citizen advisory boards, because it gets very tricky. You don't know who will be on these boards, and you cannot start a planning process that you are not able to manage in the end. It's going to be more of a hassle than help if you don't know who will be on your boards and to advise you on the plan. Now, it's one thing if they're elected officials or members of planning and zoning commissions nominated to be on their positions, but it's another thing for you to actually develop your own advisory board for these processes, where, if you really have to do that, you must be very sure that you're including diverse voices. And in other words, I don't think we should give a platform to people to run their agenda in our meetings. I would say it would be more useful to actually go to their meetings and be part of their agendas. And, you don't have to take a whole crew to their meetings, but meetings can come in different formats. As a planner, I've always tried to look at it on a case-by-case basis and understand what the community is and what their political makeup is and what kind of citizen participation is in that community in general. And then, there are different formats that work for different types of communities. You can have design open houses, you can have workshops, you can have town hall style meetings, you can attend their neighborhood meetings and seek their input that way. So looking at which type of meeting is suitable for what type of audience is the first step, I think. And then when you must have these boards because somebody above you wants you to have them, or maybe it is beneficial for the process because you don't have an active community. But at least, you get the process going with those 5 or 10 people who are on that board. I would say keeping the size small would help. Like maybe ideally, it'll be 7 to 10 people, at the max 12 people, because it just gets hard to schedule meetings and then somebody doesn't show up through half of the process, and then they come back, and now you are having to take of actually getting them up to speed on this process, and it just gets harder. The more people you have on your citizen advisory committee, the harder it becomes. The other thing is also, I see that most communities rely mostly on consultants to run their planning processes, which is because we're all short-staffed. We all have to take help. But at the end of the day, the planner has, acts as a bridge between the community and the consultant team. The planner looks at, things that are being implemented on a day-to-day basis. So looking at all these, I feel like the planner must take more responsibility than just, asking the consultants to manage a process. Getting your boards and commissions involved is also a good way to keep the process going. And the last thing is, do not get in the weeds. Like if you feel like you are, facing an issue with a particular topic and you have to go dig deeper, and then you go so far that you don't know how to come back and finish the plan, that's not a good path to follow either. So I would say, there's always a sub-planning study or focus area study that you can do at another date. But, look at the big picture that you have to complete the plan, and you must include all this feedback. You know that there are issues that have to be resolved, but then there are some issues that cannot be resolved right away, but would need further planning and study. That's all I have, Evan.
Great. No, thank you for that. I don't know, Bill, you said a little bit, and I think in the interest of time, we do have several more scenarios. So Joel, can you switch over to scenario 2 so we can see that one?
All right, can you see scenario 2 now?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, perfect.
Yes. All right, so a property owner comes to your office informing you that it's purchased a prefab outbuilding and intends to locate it on their property. The owner is combative at the start. What a surprise. During the conversation, you realize that the proposed location doesn't comply with the zoning regulations. In explaining that the location won't be allowed administratively, the owner gets upset, refuses to allow you to speak, and refuses to listen to your explanation and possible options. After a brief discussion, the owner leaves and then returns the next day, combative again, questioning why setbacks exist, telling you that this is the only town that cares about such things, asking why they must submit fees with applications, and not wanting to hear the answers. The resident is loud and is attracting the attention of others in the building. Knowing that the structure has already been purchased and a delivery date has been set, how do you proceed with this property owner? Jeremy, did you want to start this one off?
Sure. So this is a situation that we had recently here in our office, and it started out with the individuals that work out in the front of the office, and I'm sitting back here in my space, and I can hear this going on. So I stepped out there, and this is a situation where the resident. This is a small town. We've got 13,000 people. I know a lot of the players and the actors in town, but certainly I don't know everybody. This is somebody that we have not dealt with in a number of years, who hasn't been in, and has traveled to the Big E, and at one of these sales room displays at the Big E decided to purchase a prefab building, and that they're going to have it dropped off. And it's one of those things where you go back and forth in your mind thinking, why did you come talk to me? I wish you would just put it on your property. We never would have known you live in the woods, but now that you're here, we know about it and we need to deal with this. At the end of the day, and I will say, I'll jump ahead and I'll say that I spoke to this homeowner maybe an hour ago, and our relationship is done an about face, and we get along great. She calls me, I call her, we're working through the process. But I think for me, it's always helpful when, to remember that when somebody comes in angry or combative, people aren't angry or combative at the start. That's coming from somewhere else. So for me, I have to kind of take a step back and remind myself that anger that that frustration is coming from somewhere else, and it's probably anxiety or fear. You know, in a lot of people's minds, if they're not dealing with us as office staff, we're these bots, and they're coming to this government building to deal with this rule, that, you know, the set of rules and regulations that they're not familiar with and they don't understand, but they know they need to deal with it. And we're this other person on the counter, and all she's getting from our side at that moment is no. And the first answer was no, it doesn't fit in that position. But once that no gets set in, that's all she can hear. She can no longer hear anything other than the no. I've already paid for this building. The answer can't be no. So I find that it's helpful to kind of, again, take a step back and meet the residents at their level. And one of the ways that I like to do that is to tell a personal story. And so in this instance, what I was able to do, I was able to break through to her on day 2, that, you know, I understand where you want to put your garage. I understand that you have slopes on your property that limits you. I understand that your driveway is located such. And I told her about my own personal situation. I have a house that's 6 feet from the property line with a setback that's 20. I'd love to have a front porch, but I can't have it. So I got into her a little bit. I broke through that wall a little bit by telling this personal story and bringing myself down to her level and saying, hey, listen, I'm a homeowner too, and I get it. I understand the frustration. I'd love to do things that I can't do either. And that sort of started to break the ice. We had a discussion about going to Zoning Board of Appeals for variance, and that began the discussion about why there was a fee associated with that. And there was a frustration with the level of fee. When an administrative permit for something like this is only $25, how come it cost me $300 to go to Zoning Board of Appeals? And again, I was able to kind of step back and say, hey, I understand that the cost burden on that, but let me explain to you, we're not taking your money and stuffing it in a drawer somewhere. We've got costs too. So it became an educational opportunity to be able to talk this person through the process, explain, you know, where our fees come from, why we do what we do. You know, you've got a septic on your property. We need to protect that. You've got neighbors. We need to protect them. You know, you've got wetlands toward the back of your property. We need to be able to protect that, and kind of go through all of those things. But I think the first step on our side of the counter is to recognize that this person is not angry with you. They're frustrated with the process, and it comes from a place of anxiety or fear. And for me, that's the one thing that I always need to remind myself. And again, I'll say the same thing that Susmitha said earlier. I am not a conflict resolution expert either. You know, I deal with internal conflicts all the time, so I'm not perfect. But you know, I think that one of the things that we need to remember is that people that are on the other side of the counter are struggling to understand what it is that we do. And so we need to be really good about explaining what those things are. And this is my zoning enforcement officer hat on, of course, at this time. And we've actually, you know, this homeowner, that the process has gotten much better. She decided to apply for a variance, and she's scheduled for a public hearing coming up in a couple of weeks. So, you know, again, it's about explaining, but you need to come down to their level, and that was the only way I was going to ever break through with this individual.
So, Jeremy, I think you're spot on all of that, and a couple of key pieces there: avoiding kind of regulatory speak to folks when they come in with that anxiety. Their question: did I make the wrong decision in buying this? Have I just wasted a lot of money? And what sounds like you did is you displayed empathy. Maya Angelou said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So once she felt that you were actually listening to her, and it sounds like you were doing some reflecting back of what was important to her and interests, and explaining, and kind of doing that educational piece is very important. People also will play to the audience. So if you can do it safely, taking them to a meeting room or your office where there aren't other people around that they are using to try to gin up support for themselves. And there are medical studies that if a physician sits with somebody as opposed to standing over them in the consult, the person will think they've spent more time with them, will be more compliant with their treatment recommendations, and will have better health outcomes. So if you can sit with the person and be almost eye to eye and have a conversation and model that calm behavior, it will start to bring the temperature down and reflect back what you're hearing from them. It can really help in the moment, kind of using those active listening skills. And if you need to, maybe go out and do a site visit and just walk around with them to see the property so that they can express it to you.
Yeah, and I think, and I'll just say one other thing too. I think one of the other ways that I was able to break through a little bit was helping her to get through the paperwork process. And our paperwork, we try to keep it simple. It's one sheet, but you've got questions that you need to answer, and just sitting there going through line by line. What should I say? What do I write? How do I do this? And just explaining, here's something that you could write. Not saying this is the answer, but this is what you could put in on your application. Tell us this, and kind of going through line by line and just helping her get through that process, because that paperwork is intimidating as well.
And that actually changes the physical dynamic. When you are across the table from somebody, it sets up an oppositional mental framework. If you're looking at a piece of paper together side by side, you're working together on something. And that changes the priming for somebody's mental state. So there's a comment in the Q&A about wait till she gets denied by the ZBA for no hardship. So you may need to prepare people for likely outcomes.
Yeah, and I will say we had that conversation, I think that with the property set up as it is, and knowing our zoning board of appeals, I'm pretty confident she'll get what she's looking for.
Evan, it also looks like we have a hand up for somebody to ask a question.
Yeah. I'm not sure if we're able to allow folks to speak. Joel, is that possible?
If you click on them and use
Yes, we can allow them to speak.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, allow talk.
Mhm.
All right.
So Alice should be can unmute herself now.
Maybe it was an errant hand.
Sorry, if that was me, it was an error.
Okay, no worries.
Let's why don't we jump into scenario 3? All right, here we go. You are working on a bicycle and pedestrian plan for your community, and in the past few years, you've noticed that the number of cyclists and pedestrians in the town center has increased, although they still constitute a minor proportion of the total population. Your planning and zoning commissioners don't think it's important to focus on a bike ped plan right now, especially when there are other important planning issues to deal with. In order to seek grant funding for the bike ped infrastructure, you know that you need a plan and a town adopted complete streets policy. How would you collaborate with your local land use commissions and legislators on this issue? Who wants to take that one?
I can take that one, Evan. Oftentimes we find that, we involve our commissioners only when we're working on a plan or a proposal or a development application. And by that time, it's too late, because some people are supportive of it, or, most are unsupportive of it. Especially when it comes to development applications, I've noticed that, it's not related to bicycle and pedestrian plan, but maybe another example could be an affordable housing, application, which is a hot button issue right now. We see that there is a resistance for these kind of planning efforts, because people are so focused on day-to-day stuff, and they're focused on things that they already know. But believe it or not, when they're voting on an application, when they're conducting a public hearing, when they're being part of these meetings, they're not just there doing things right away. Most commissions that I have noticed have the same people floating around in different commissions and boards. Like they do 2 terms on planning, then they go 2 terms on zoning, then they go to town council. So they're being educated about what the process is like. They're being educated about what the typical applications look like, and how do you find consistency? How do you, vote on an application? Who gets to talk? Who doesn't get to talk? I think the commissions are not as educated on planning issues. We don't collaborate with them, or we don't engage them every month on discussing big picture planning topics. And if we can actually have a standing item on the administrative agenda to discuss, planning that is important for the community, the next level planning, like bicycle and pedestrian plan, if you think that is an important plan to pursue, maybe you should start slow and first engage them in a discussion. What is it that concerns them the most, and why do they think it's not an important issue? Once you gather feedback, you go back and bring knowledge to the table. They would obviously appreciate you as technical staff bringing knowledge to the table, looking at trends, statistics. Maybe do your own counts at the town center or on key locations where you find that there are more number of bicyclists and pedestrians than before. And, maybe arrange some speaker series or informal workshops to engage them, to, let them know about best practices and what's happening in other communities. Not always, I know we get this kind of flexibility in timelines. Sometimes we are bound by state statutes and rigid timelines to finish a plan before a certain deadline. But what helps is, keeping up to date on what is happening in the community and communicating that with your commissioners and engaging them, bringing them to events if they can. If you're holding a workshop or a pop-up event, I would say you are a facilitator, but they should be the managers of the process. And they are the ones who should be hearing firsthand from their constituents on what's happening in the community. And, that will help them make better decisions for that community. I also think that, most commissioners are unable to connect the dots. They know that a POCD is important for grant funding or for zoning. So they can, participate in those discussions because they've been part of it before. But sub-level planning like bicycle and pedestrian plans, I don't think many communities do that kind of planning. So they don't know how this relates to the big picture and how this impacts other aspects of the town, like economic development, placemaking, multimodal transportation, sustainability. So I think you can try to connect the dots for them and tie it into a long-term vision for the community. And whatever you do, make sure that you don't go right away in the defense and attack. When somebody says, we don't think this plan is important to our community, you don't start off saying, no, it is important, I think so. I would say, bring them gradually into the process so that they understand its relevance and they're able to make a better decision for themselves.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left, and I know we have a couple more scenarios. So why don't we, Bill, did you want to say anything on scenario 3 before we get to the next one?
No, I think it's good. The only thing that I would suggest is if somebody comes back, as Susmitha just said, and says, I don't think that's a good idea, absolutely don't go back and say, I think it is. Ask them the question. Why don't you think it's a good idea? What is it that has you having reservations about developing this kind of a plan now? And then you'll know how to respond in a way that will be framed and meet what their concerns are and answer those concerns and move it forward in terms of a more productive discussion.
All right. Let's move on to scenario 4. And again, any questions, drop them in the Q&A box. So the owners of a convenience store and fueling station, which exists in a legal non-conforming condition, have presented informally to the Planning and Zoning Commission to change the zone of 3 properties that they own to then file an application to rebuild and expand their existing facility. The commission informally states that it would review such an application, and most members state that they are generally in favor due to the many non-conforming properties in the immediate vicinity. Upon filing the application for a zone change, the applicant is met with community resistance due to the presence of a building which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, though deteriorated and uninhabitable. Public hearings attract well over 150 residents, the vast majority of which speak in opposition. The applicant and the residents have hired attorneys to present to the commission on their behalves. Through informal conversations, you know that many residents are in favor of the proposal because it could result in a more attractive intersection, but they are largely silent. How would you work with both sides, and how would you advise the commission? Jeremy, is this one that you want to address?
Yeah, sure. This is one of my situations here, and I think we've all probably been through something similar. This was a gas station that's been in place since the 40s. It was commercially zoned up until 1990. The zone had changed on it, back in 1990, and so it was a non-conforming situation in a residential area. The residential area, which only allows single family, but the corner that it's on is surrounded by a bunch of multifamilies. The owner of the fueling station owned a couple of properties surrounding it, multifamily buildings, which had been uninhabitable for a couple of years. Really just a beat up corner in town, and really could use redevelopment. As it says there, they went informally to P&Z and got kind of a sort of a thumbs up, if you will, and then the community was not on the side of the applicant. So it got tricky. I had an application. We had the applicant, their attorney, who really were not willing to bend to try to meet the community and the residents in the middle. They basically had a square foot size that they had in mind for their new store and a number of gas pumps, and they wanted that number. And they really were not willing to decrease from there. We had a community who largely said, you've got a gas station, you get to keep it, and that's that. And we really were at loggerheads, and the Planning and Zoning Commission was somewhat stuck in the middle, because I think we had a lot of members who looked at this thing and said, this would be a good improvement for that area of town. But we had a little bit of a legal problem, because we had a zone issue. We had non-conforming statutes. We had everything that you could think of. We were dealing with. We had regulations that needed to be updated in order to allow this thing to happen if the zone change went through. So it was a complex issue. It went on for months. The first application got denied. They came back with a slightly different application, and really, there was no. I worked with the applicant to try to get them to canvass the community, go out. Get the residents in the area to understand where you're coming from. Talk to the direct neighbors. Give us a concept plan that sort of, this is a zone change application. We haven't even gotten a site plan or special permit. We're simply a zone change, but give us a concept so that people know what your goal is. So what I ultimately ended up doing, and again, I'm just wading my way through this thing. What I ended up doing was I've got 150 to 200 residents who are writing letters and signing petitions, and obviously I can't meet with all of them. So I tried to handpick about 6 to 8, maybe up to 10, who were sort of liaisons, if you will. Some of which I knew before the process started, just because they're residents who come to meetings and are involved. Some of which I didn't know before this process began, but got to know through this process. And I met with them individually or in small groups and tried to get a sense for, is there a redevelopment that the community could support? Is there some level of redevelopment that you think the folks that are out there could get behind, or are we at a standstill? And really what it came down to for me was the community was not going to, or at least the folks that were willing to come to meetings and speak to the commission were not going to be in favor of this at all. So I got to a point where there was no compromise. What I needed to focus on was getting the commission, advising the commission on making a legal and sound decision based on the information in front of them. Look at the facts of the case, look at the history of the property, look at where we are today, look at statutes. What do our regulations say? Look at the evidence that's been presented by both sides, and make the soundest legal decision that the commission could. And ultimately, that's what this became about, was we're not going to get to compromise. We're not going to get the applicants and the residents in the same room talking to each other. It actually, we had a couple of hearings that started to get ugly with some name throwing going around, and our chairman was really good about squashing that. But ultimately, the application was denied, and I think the commission made the right decision. The decision was not appealed, it did not go to court, and I think that's because the applicant knew that the commission's decision was on pretty solid legal ground. So, you know, sometimes you get these situations where conflict resolution really just becomes about, it's not so much mediation, it's not so much bringing the two sides of the table together, it's just putting your blinders on and saying, we got to make a fair and legal decision, whatever that means. And that's kind of where we landed with this one.
Yeah, I just want to add that you can make everyone happy. As long as you're adhering to the zoning regs and doing everything legally right. And, you know, I think that's the way to go.
I agree. And I love that example, because collaboration and public engagement processes are not always appropriate. They don't always work. And doing that assessment and understanding and doing it clear-eyed is important. And even if you have a fabulous outcome, there's going to be a group of people who are unhappy. But what you want to be able to do is have them feel that they were heard in the process, that they were respected in the process, and that even if they disagree with the substantive outcome, the way it was arrived at was legal and fair, and they had an opportunity to participate, whether it's through an informal collaborative process or through the formal commission hearings. So.
And I must say, I am absolutely shocked that the land use lawyers were unwilling to budge at all in their respective positions. That is just shocking to me. But we've got about 5 minutes left. I know we have a couple more scenarios. Do you guys think we can get through one, or should we start opening up to questions and concluding the presentation?
If people have questions, it's what's on their mind.
Yeah. Type any questions into the chat box, or rather the Q&A button. I do have one question to pose as we wait for people to see if we have any additional questions. But in your example, Jeremy, highly contentious, 150 residents at the public hearings, and that's never comfortable for anyone. The planners, the commissioners. How do you approach a situation like that, where there's just so many people involved in the process, and presumably on both sides? I know I've been in situations where there have been over 100 people at public hearings, and half the room is in favor of the application and the other half's opposed to it, and standing ovation after a representative of each side makes their statement. So do you approach situations like that any differently when there's such public interest and so many people attending the public hearing? It's hard not to be cautious and on alert because you're under scrutiny. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I will say, so we had 3 different applications regarding this particular project. The first 2 went to Planning and Zoning Commission, and then they tried the Zoning Board of Appeals approach. The first one was in the heat of COVID and was fully on Zoom, which was really convenient in a lot of ways because we weren't in the same room. The second one was in person. The numbers in the room were low, the numbers online were high. And then the third one, the Zoning Board of Appeals, was also in person, and that was mostly attended by folks in person. Again, this is a small town, and the vast majority of the people in the room were opposed to the application, and those were residents who live in this town. And I'm the planner who serves the residents of this town. I also serve the applicants and the business owners in this town. So I've got to treat everybody fairly. And my whole goal was just to make sure that I was administering, again, a fair and legal process, and making sure that people, the community members, felt heard. And I was open about that. Email me, call me, write me letters, we'll talk. And I talked and was listening until I was blue in the face, because that's what I needed to do. I needed to make sure that they all felt as though I was hearing them, and then work with the commission to make sure that the commission was hearing them. And I did hear some feedback that, well, we felt like the commission didn't hear us. Well, I understand that, they're a 7-member body. They did hear you. They saw your letter, but I never got any feedback that they felt as though I wasn't hearing them. So I don't know what the takeaway of that is, but I think the fact that I was willing to meet these people again on their level and listen to what their concerns were and bring their concerns back to the commission. I mean, and I would write very, I didn't take a position. I didn't take a for or against position. I stayed right in the middle. And I was honest with people about that. I was honest with the applicants about that. I was honest with the public about that. And I was honest about that with the commission, that on this one, because of how contentious it was and because of how many issues we had on both sides, I was going to stay in the middle and I was just going to speak to facts. And that's what my staff reports were. They were fact-based and provide the history of the property, things like that. So for this one, I felt like staying in the middle made the most sense, but making sure that the community felt heard.
I think that's wonderful, and people are intimidated by public process, and they're intimidated by the meetings and the typical town hall forum like atmosphere where you get that shouting down. When you can front load the process where it maybe happens outside of the formal process, what I often end up doing is developing a set of framing questions. We bring people together, we do a short presentation, and then we break them up into small groups with table facilitators to walk through the framing questions, taking notes, and then we reflect that back through the themes. I've done that with groups as large as 140. We did that in Massachusetts with that size group, and then we did a traditional town hall forum afterwards, and only 20 people spoke. They stayed to their time limits. Nobody booed, nobody did other things. And I also just, in closing, will say that for the person that walks up to your office and starts shouting at you or raises their voice, I've had that happen in breaks in public meetings. And what I have found tends to work is I look at the person and say, Jeremy, I hear I know what you have to say is very important to you, and you want me to understand and hear it. When you say it in that way and use that tone and that kind of language, it makes it hard for me to hear and respond to it. When you're ready to have the conversation in a way that we can have a conversation about it and I can hear you, I'm happy to have that conversation. Let me know when you're ready. And it just sets, some people need boundaries, and you need to just set that boundaries. And I have found that works with folks. So.
I also want to add one last thing. I think setting ground rules in the meetings would help too. And I know that no matter what you say and how much knowledge you bring to the table, sometimes people have an opinion and you can't change those opinions. I mean, they're set in stone and they come with an agenda. And as long as you have meeting ground rules for civil behavior to be heard and respected and listen to all sides, I think as a planner, you've done your job.
Well, look at that. We are just 1 minute over our time, so we stayed relatively on schedule. But thank you to all our panelists for all of your contributions today. Bill, Susmitha, Jeremy, Emmeline, and Joel for the IT support. And thank you everyone who attended today. If you have any follow-up questions or want to get in contact with us, please feel free to. You can email me and I can get you in touch with these other folks. eseeman@rc.com, ESEEMAN@rc.com. And thanks a lot. Hope you have a great rest of the day.